Welcome to the Unearthed Man Podcast, the journey to becoming a conscious man. Hey all, Stephen here, and welcome to episode 69 of the Unearthed Man Podcast. Now, how energizing was Ken Stern from last week's episode? It was fun to have him on, and I love his podcast concept of finding strangers and have them pick a topic from the jar and just talk into that topic as part of the podcast. So about a month ago, I had the honor and privilege to host 8 men at my inaugural Unearthed Man campout retreat. To kick off the weekend, we ventured to a beautiful area on the Great Ocean Road called Red Rocks. The walk-in is around 1.5 kilometres, which is about a mile, with views of the ocean before you can make your way to a fantastic cliff top overlooking the ocean. As per the name, the colour of the cliff face is a deep red. On arrival, we requested permission from the Indigenous elders to enter the land and requested they look over us, ensuring we remained safe during the retreat. After acknowledging the local Wadawurrung people, I handed over to a multi-man, joining us to perform the haka. This has traditionally been a war dance. However, on this occasion, it symbolised the coming together of the men in this special location. It was a powerful way to kick off the retreat through the acknowledgement of the Indigenous people of both Australia and New Zealand. Now, it's on this point that I acknowledge the traditional custodians of this unceded land and pay respects to the elders, past, present, and emerging. Now, a shout out to our sponsor, Surf Coast Wellness Rooms, who's based down here in Torquay, Victoria, Australia. As you know, as men, we spend a lot of time looking after and caring for others and very little time on self-care. So now you have the opportunity to change all that. If you use the code, the Unearthed Man 10 when booking, you receive a 10% discount on any of their services, including float tanks, infrared saunas, massages, and salt therapy. It's great to use before or after a day at the beach. You can find a link to the website and the code below. Now, here are a few things to go through before we kick off with today's guest. The Unearthed Man community continues to grow as we go week by week. It comprises men who are willing to be supported and support other men. So if you're a man or know of a man who's seeking his tribe or his community, then please use the link in the show notes below to sign up. Alternatively, just message me via any of my social media channels. Secondly, please subscribe to this podcast via your preferred app and leave a review. The quickest way to enable the podcast become more accessible worldwide is to receive a 5-star review. By doing this, you also acknowledge and thank my guests for their time, effort, and wisdom. And finally, if you are a man who's struggling with the daily grind, have got constant feelings of guilt, shame, or anxiety, you're feeling irritated or frustrated, you've lost track of who you are with a deep inner sense that there's got to be more to life than this, then reach out so we can have a chat. Expressions of interest for my 8-week men's empowerment program are now open. And as a reminder, I only take 10 men into each of my 8-week programs, and the spots are actually filling up pretty quickly. Now, onto today's episode. My guest today permitted himself to break and untangle the mindsets he inherited growing up in an emotionally and physically abusive family in rural Arkansas. Childhood trauma caused depression and anxiety to follow him into adulthood, but he developed a method for managing those. He realized he could do much better than just survive. He could thrive. He's a best-selling author, award-winning speaker on human behaviour, and founder of the Institute for Human Progress and Development. He has worked with thousands of high-performing professionals worldwide, helping them achieve greater clarity, perspective, and overall well-being. Welcome to the Unearthed Man Podcast, Chad Peevy. Hey, Chad, how are you?
I'm great, Stephen. How are you?
Very well indeed, thank you. Great to have you on the show. I know that we connected via Podmatch and we've been interacting back and forth. I love the opportunity to get international guests onto the podcast, given that I'm Australia-based, because for me, it actually shows that it probably doesn't matter where we are in the world. We all sometimes have things in common, which is, maybe our childhoods weren't the best, or we had a few things that we had to deal with and everything else. So it's great to have that chance to have the chat with you today about that.
Yeah, the human experience has no borders, and I appreciate the opportunity today to be Mr. Worldwide with you.
No, that's excellent. It was interesting. I was talking to someone recently, and it's just a simple thing before we get into your story about we have these little things around office workers versus field-based workers, and how they don't get on and how they have everything else. And they'll ask me, these are the men, and we how do we get them to work better together? And it's like, well, one thing you got to find out is that help them find something that's common about themselves. So often if you get these mixed groups into a room and you go, okay, who plays golf? You might find that, 30% of both sides play golf, and all of a sudden they realize that they have more in common from some of the things they do, like follow sports or play sports or have kids, or they've had different lived experiences. And all they're doing is judging themselves by the role they have, not the commonalities they have. And I think as men, that's something we can start to learn to do a little bit better as we go through, looking for those common traits rather than judging people for maybe the roles that they play in life.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So onto yourself. So as we talked about into the bio a little bit here, there's a couple of things. Obviously, you had some challenges growing up through your childhood in Arkansas, as we alluded to, and then that's resulted in you saying, "Hey, I can take control of my life," and you have got your behavioural institute that you're actually running with and everything else. So can we take a step back into some of those challenges? Because again, this podcast is a bit about men talking into where they came from, some of the challenges they've had, but actually seeing where they are now and how they've been able to overcome those. So can we take a step back and talk into that?
Yeah, absolutely. Martin Heidegger, the German philosopher, he had this idea. He called it thrownness. And he said, we get thrown into the world. We don't get to pick when in history. We don't get to pick where in the world. We don't get to pick our parents, our socioeconomic status. We don't even get to pick our name. We're just thrown into the world. And then we have to make sense of this human experience through that perspective that we're thrown into for the rest of our lives. And my sense of thrownness, my what I was thrown into was being a gay man, a gay kid, a gay human being in rural Arkansas, this extremely conservative place with a sadist dad who was the high school bully, the high school jock. And I can imagine for him, having this sensitive little boy as a son was probably quite humiliating for him. He took that out on me in all sorts of ways. I was thrown into a very conservative religious upbringing. My mom and dad had me in church every Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night. It was the Missionary Baptist Church, which is a very conservative breed of the Baptist brand. And in their eyes, being gay was worse than being a murderer. It was the worst thing you could possibly be, was to be gay. And so what I was thrown into was an environment where I had to learn how to be small. I had to learn how to figure out how to survive. I had to learn how to stay off my dad's radar. And all of those survival skills that I learned were the skills that were holding me back as I got out of that environment and got into adulthood and tried to create a thriving life. I kept hitting roadblocks, knowing and learning along my journey that those survival skills were the exact skills that were holding me back. So that was my journey. That was where I started and what I'm trying to do here.
Well, thanks for that. So at what age, for you, is that you sort of knew from a very early age, 2, 5, 7, 12? I mean, what age did you sort of go, hang on a minute, I'm feeling a bit different to everyone else. I'm not fitting this boy mold or this man mold type of thing.
Yeah. For me, I was 5 years old. And I can specifically remember that moment when I felt different. I didn't have the word gay. I wouldn't say that I knew I was gay at 5, but I definitely, as you described it very eloquently, there was that moment in my life when I realized I'm not quite like the other boys at school. And I think for me, it was sort of a moment of feeling like there was something wrong about me. There was a moment of adopting shame in that moment. When that happened.
Yeah, sorry, you just froze there for a period of time. I think you're saying about when you're about 5 and you start to feel the shame. If you don't mind, if we can head back to that space.
Yeah, so I was 5 years old, and I can specifically remember the sense of feeling othered or feeling different, just knowing that I wasn't like the other kids at school. And it's in that moment that I started wearing this idea of shame without knowing what that shame was about. It was in that moment that I realized that I was different, that I had something to hide, even though I wasn't really clear at that age what it was that made me different or that I needed to hide.
Yeah, and I suppose the reason why I asked that question, because as we know, as we go later on into life, that 0 to 7 is the formative years about
Mm-hmm.
how we are conditioned and our belief systems, and as you said, the things that actually start us to learn to play small and work out how do we need to live and survive, and how do we need to talk, and how do we need to act around parents and schools and everything else to stay safe.
Yeah.
And so for you, what was some of the go-to safety mechanisms that maybe you started to put into place? As you said, that resulted in you starting to play small, but was there specific things that you would actually do to just try to, either hide or back away or so forth?
Yeah. So there were a few different things. And I think what ties the things together for me was this idea of becoming a chameleon. So at home, I had to blend into that environment. So even though the religious stuff was completely antithetical to who I was at the core, I leaned completely into that. I mean, I was doing all sorts of things at the church to get involved, in some ways to hide in plain sight. At home, I had to stay really small because I had to stay off my dad's radar. So I would blend into that environment by literally trying to blend into the paint on the walls, just
Right.
stay completely off the radar. And then at school, the way that I was a chameleon, I was the kid that I could sit at any lunch table in the cafeteria and blend in. I knew who to be, how to hold my hand, how to use my voice, what to talk about at any lunch table in the cafeteria. So my way of surviving was becoming that chameleon. With my teachers, I would step up and take on leadership roles. I was always the teacher's pet because there was a degree of protection that came from being the teacher's pet. When it came time to start being a student leader, I leaned into the student leadership roles at school because, again, it was a way of hiding in plain sight. It was a way of getting good attention from the protective people in that environment that kept me safe from the kids. When it got time to around middle school, I was called every homophobic slur you can possibly imagine. And I wised up somewhere around middle school. I didn't know what any of those things were, by the way. I don't think the kids at school knew what they were either, but they knew they applied to me. And my fear was that they were right. And so I did what every kid in the South, in the US South, does. I got a girlfriend, because if
Right.
I have a girlfriend, you can't call me all of these things. You can't call me those homophobic slurs. And so I was doing everything I could possibly do in every environment that I found myself in, to just blend in, to be the chameleon, and to learn how to survive.
Yeah. Sorry. And I got to imagine that's just got to be tough. Like that has just have to be, there's got to be times where I'm imagining you end up back in your bedroom, isolated, and you
Mm-hmm.
feel like I can breathe. I
Yeah.
can be who I want to be. So was there places of solitude that you found you just had to try to go away with, because playing that character for so many different people for
Mm-hmm.
such a period of time must be exhausting.
It is exhausting. And you get, you get exhausted trying to figure out who you are, right?
Mm.
Because you're not getting any social cues. You're not getting any sort of feedback loop that reaffirms or confirms that this is who you are. This is before, I don't know if you have it in Australia. Will and Grace was like the first real big popular sitcom that featured gay people, right?
Yep.
And so this was before any of that happened. And to be honest, the environment that I was growing up in, had that even existed, I would never have been allowed to watch anything like that. So there was no feedback loop that gave me a sense of identity, a sense of a role model, a sense of someone that could reflect back to me who it was, who I was. So yeah, it was exhausting. I'm no stranger to depression, anxiety, loneliness, no stranger to any of that, which is the emotional consequence of always having to be who somebody else expects you to be. The emotional consequence was the depression and the anxiety. The depression they put me in with the school counselor when I was about fourth grade. I was in fourth grade, and they realized at that time, you're not quite like any of the other kids.
Mm-hmm.
And they weren't labeling it depression. And I'm kind of glad that at that age they were not giving me that label to carry around with me. But they did give me a sad label. Like, Chad is always sad.
Right.
And it wasn't until much later in life that I realized that I wasn't sad, and depression isn't sadness. Freud said that depression is rage turned inward.
Yep.
And when I heard that definition, it just like bells went off in me, because as even a little kid and even as a young man, I wasn't sad. I was really freaking mad. I was really mad, but I had no healthy outlet to direct that anger. Had I directed that anger back at my dad, who was emotionally and physically abusive, he might literally have killed me. Had I been angry and directed that anger at the kids at school who were bullying me, that would have been physically dangerous for me. So the only place for that rage to go was inward, and the consequence of that being the depression. So yeah, to answer your question, I'm no stranger to depression, anxiety, loneliness, and yes, it is extremely exhausting trying to figure out who you are and where you fit in and where it's safe.
Yeah, I can only probably try to imagine what that would actually be like. I mean, I know I grew up, but I was actually in a position with my dad where I could actually express, although I turned to alcohol and had a lot of other challenges through my life. But for me, there was, I always come back to two words, which is around expression and suppression. And as a young child, if we're not able to have a safe environment where we can safely express, even though I was expressing anger, that actually came at a cost, and so it wasn't like it was an accepted thing to actually do. It was condemned as a thing to do. So we have to find a place where we can safely do that expression. Otherwise, yeah, I agree with you. We end up in suppression land, and suppression starts to lead to depression. Because we're now living a life that's not congruent with who we truly are, or who we're truly meant to be. And the further we move away from who we are meant to be, that we're put on this earth for and how to live, and then we start to move further away, then yes, then we start to, that depression can get higher and higher, because we just start to get disconnected, and we lose a sense of purpose and where we can go. So again, back in rural Arkansas, so were you on farms, or like how rural are we sitting? I mean, I'm just trying to paint a picture for everyone else to sort of sit there and see, farm life, because I know I grew up in the country, and sadly, and I'll say sadly, because there's a guy I grew up with who farm, same thing, out in the farm. He ended up married, kids, grandkids, and pretty much at the late 40s, he was at an airport with his wife. And his wife saw him checking out a guy, and she's like, "Well, I just saw you look at that guy." And then they both realized that he's been gay his whole life, but he grew up in an environment, again, in country, where I live, country Victoria, where I remember going to school. I'm thinking, how would have we behaved if we knew there was a guy that was gay? And then we had some gay guys in the Catholic school, and they weren't treated well. They weren't treated well. We had a level of Catholicism, living in the country, play football, do all this, rough, tough men stuff. And so we were just completely ignorant and probably arrogant at the same time. And so I assume that was a lot of the friends, like the people that you were hanging out with. How did you go about from friendship groups? I mean, I know you said that you end up with a girlfriend. So how did you go through that with a friendship group and everything else?
Yeah, so a lot of good questions there. The first one, Arkansas. What was Arkansas like? I think we had 2 stoplights, traffic lights.
Right.
When I was growing up, the population was about 2,500, and I think I graduated in a class of 183. So it was pretty small. I grew up on 15 acres. We had goats, we had chickens, rabbits, turkeys, dogs, all of the things. And so I got, I had a 4-wheeler when I was a kid. I learned to drive a Jeep, through the fields when I was, as old enough to even attempt to reach the pedals. Yep. So there was like this sense of enchanted childhood. Like I really do feel grateful for the opportunity to grow up in the country. there was something magical about growing up in the country that I really, really did enjoy, absent some of the people. So as far as friends, I found solace in band, marching band.
Okay.
It wasn't exactly gay. It was gay friendly. So if you were an oddball, if you were different, band was a pretty good place for you to be. And there have been a lot of studies that talk about why something like marching band and being in a group and doing something physical and being in community with people like that are really good for kids and builds their resilience. And so that's really where I found all of my friends. I have to admit, though, I'm not close to anybody that I was quote unquote friends with in high school. It was really hard for me to be close to people in high school because I didn't trust any of them. Like I didn't trust any of them to know who I really was. And so I was able to get along and have a social life with them, but I was never really close, even like platonically intimate. That never existed for me as a kid. And that's always been a challenge for me. I think that's another one of those consequences of growing up like that. And the story that you told about the guy that came out later in life, my clients, I deal with quite a few men who have had that experience in my work. And that is one of the fears that I have. I'm first of all, I'll preface this by saying I think it's wonderful that the gay community specifically, the gay and lesbian community specifically, has had so much progress and is becoming less of other. That being said, and I'm glad that younger people, for the most part, have a lot more role models. They have a lot more support, and depending on the family that they're in, their coming out experiences are just dramatically different than what they were even 10, 15 years ago. So I'm happy about that. But what makes me sad and what makes me fearful about my community is that I fear that we're going to forget about those guys that you're describing who grew up in a different time, that coming out even now is terrifying and scary. And there are a lot more consequences coming out when you've been married and you've got kids and you've created a life. There are a lot of consequences for that. And I think what's so important about like the life coaching and doing men's work thing is that you and I share is that those guys need support. Those men need support because what they're going through is no small thing. And there are a lot of consequences. It's a different coming out experience when you've built a life as a straight man coming out than it is a 20-year-old kid coming out. Totally different.
Yeah, no, definitely would agree. I do have to ask a question about the marching band.
Yeah.
Was there did you play an instrument? Like, what was did you have a specific instrument as part of the marching band? What was your go-to?
Yeah, I was drum major. So I was the guy that was conducting at the front. That was another way of me hiding in plain sight.
Yeah. Love it.
And being in charge. If I'm in charge, you can't beat me up.
Correct. That's right. The reason why I did that is that I actually was part of a marching band myself, but I played third cornet, which was pretty much the level of skill set I had. I'd go burp, that was about it, and hidden somewhere in the middle of all the marches so that I could march properly and pretend I wasn't playing. That's a different story. So I'm intrigued on the word too, and I'd love to explore this with you if you don't mind, Chad. Is that we still talk in today's terms of having to come out. And so for me, I think that's interesting itself in the fact that we still see that would still allude to the fact that there is a right way to be heterosexual, all this sort of stuff. And then there's the coming out. And will you accept me for this other person who I am? They're in a world where we're just all human. And we're all biological and we're all energy and we're all part of this universe. As you said, we were placed here or we were thrown in here to just do what we had to do.
Yeah.
Would you love to see a time where someone doesn't have to come out? They just go, hey, it's as normal to grow up and have a girlfriend as it is to grow up and have a boyfriend if you're a guy. Like, it's just as normal to this? Or do you think there's some importance around having the need to sort of come out and say, this is who I am? Does that question make a bit of sense?
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. I'm just thinking about my answer. I wrote about it in my book. When I first came out, I was 22. I was in college. I had gay experiences before I came out. But when I talk about my coming out, I specifically mean telling my mom and dad.
Yep.
That was like the big moment for me of like, there's going to be a sit down and we need to talk. So for me, at that moment, it was more colored through the lens of a sexual declaration. And the older I've gotten and the more reflective I've become on the topic, I think of it more of a spiritual declaration than a sexual declaration. And to me, a very important one, because it's a way of me reclaiming what we were talking about earlier, that sort of identity construction that happens at that first moment of shame and realizing that you're different. And then, so the coming out for me was almost, to me, a way of reclaiming and declaring that this is not something that I'm ashamed of. And yes, I am different. And so for me, it was empowering. I don't know if in my lifetime that I have to worry about your question. Because I know what it's like still in Arkansas. I know the legislation that we're still fighting here in this country to have equal rights. And I know the urge in my own country to create an other. And as long as we're creating others and not sharing in the human experience more fully, I think there will continue to be a need to have a coming out.
Yep.
If a person has the opportunity to not, I think that that's wonderful. But in a general sense, I don't know that in my lifetime that we'll have to make that decision, whether I think that would be possible.
Yeah. And I can understand that because, I still see, pretty much around the world, you still sort of see, that phobia, which, I struggle with myself personally to understand that. But, and I think maybe you've touched on that point. I think because people sexualize it.
Mm-hmm.
As you said, like you come out and had the conversation, but it was more about, hey, here's my sexual preference to be with a guy, as opposed to a spiritual preference, which is I just love someone.
Yeah.
And they just happen to have the same anatomy as what I do.
Yep.
And so, I think that's a really good distinction. And I think I don't know, but I feel that there is this fear that, and I think mainly guys are the ones who drive all the phobia. I don't think it's as much in females. I definitely feel it's a lot in males. And I think that they just have this fear because they actually fear, they're immature sexually.
Yeah.
And I think we've got a very sexually immature world and society. And I don't think porn's helping that at all. I don't think some of these things are actually helping that because there's still lots of little boys playing little sexual games and then building a belief system around that. I think if we could get to the point where it's just a spiritual choice, no different to a guy saying to a woman, can we get married? A guy saying to a guy, can we get married? A woman saying to a woman, can we get married? It's a spiritual choice and it's a soul connection. And it'd be great if we could get to that point somewhere along the line. And I also feel obviously a lot of religions block that. And for me, that's a political game.
Yep.
That's a money game, a political game, a control game,
Yep.
which a lot of people get blinded to because of they wrap it up in a thing called faith,
Yep.
and faith becomes separatism, as you've spoken into, which is pretty sad. So round 22. So what did that experience look like for you? I really want to get on to where you are now, and all the great stuff you're actually
Yeah.
doing. So sorry, but I think this is a great
All right.
journey for people to go through. What was that experience with your parents, and having to have that sit down conversation? And I'd love to know where you're at now with them, if that's okay.
Yeah. And I want to just touch just a little bit on what you just said with how men specifically are driving the phobia. Because I think you're right. One of the things that I learned in group therapy, I've done quite a bit of group therapy. And one of the things that I learned is that as I'm sitting in that group and I'm looking around at all the faces, what I'm really looking at are mirrors. I'm looking in the mirror when I see all those other people. And when someone says something in a group and it pisses me off, they're probably hitting on a truth somewhere within me. Or if they're rubbing me the wrong way, I'm seeing a part of myself in them that I was blind to or have chosen not to see. And I think that might be where that fear gets driven, is because of all the things that you mentioned from religion and toxic masculinity and all of that stuff, that men absolutely get triggered and rejected and create phobias and fear around that entire idea of being gay. So I get that. I don't like it, but I get it. My coming out was messy, really, really messy. There was no blueprint for me for coming out. So I was at university and I went home for the weekend and I sat my mom and dad down in the living room and started telling them that I'm gay. And my dad was very, very quiet, sitting in his lazy boy recliner, very, very quiet. And I think he was probably quiet because he knew, and he had always suspected. When I was in ninth grade, I overheard my mom and dad arguing in the living room. And I remember my mom saying to my dad, you just need to give him more attention, talking about me. Just give him more attention, spend more time with him. And my dad says something to the effect of, well, he just acts like a little faggot. And I knew, I carried that around. I never said anything about it, but I carried that around, and I carried that with me going into that conversation at 22, telling them that I was gay. And he was just sitting there quiet. And he said things like, well, that's fine, but don't you ever bring anybody home with you. Like, you can be gay, but we never want to know anything about that. My mother, on the other hand, was hysterical and was, which was also surprising. I mean, on my website, I have pictures of when I was a kid trying to play football, and I'm in this pose like I'm about to walk the runway in a sparkling clean football costume. So I don't know why they were so surprised, or she acted so surprised, but she was hysterical, and she said horrible things. She said, well, who's going to take care of you when you get AIDS? Something else that I carried with me, and still do. And so, and I remember also, I mean, I said terrible things as well. I mean, I had reached a point where, I mean, I wanted to disrupt. I was mad. I've been mad all of my life. And I'd worked up the gumption, the spine in that moment to come out. And I was like, I'm going to throw grenade after grenade. Guess what? I can go have kids too. I'm going to go have a baby with a lesbian. And I was just coming up with all sorts of this, like, things that for a conservative rural Arkansas couple to hear their son say, like, he's going to have babies with lesbians, like, that was just like, the Antichrist was sitting in their living room that day. And I knew it. I mean, I knew what I was doing. But it was a very emotionally charged and difficult day with a lot of tears between me and my mother, and my dad being very stoic and just being demonstrative about this is my house and you're never bringing anybody in it like that. So that was my coming out. Since then, we tried to have a relationship. My dad wasn't just abusive to me. He was also abusive to my mom. And she was young and naive when they got married. And they were babies having babies when they had me. They were very young when they had me. And I think that she was always just scared of him and afraid to leave. But when I was 30, she finally left him. And that was their divorce hearing was actually the last day that I ever spoke to my dad. And my mom and I have had a lot of breaks over the years where we won't talk to one another. And I've spent most of my life in therapy and working on that. And I get asked the question a lot about how do you know when to cut off a relationship, especially an important relationship like with a parent. And the way I've always answered that makes sense to me and how I found resolution to that question was my mom. It's like a dance partner. If you have a willing dance partner, even if they stump your toe nonstop, if they're willing to keep dancing, that's a relationship to keep going in my mind. She says stupid stuff all the time that really gets to me. And I still say stupid stuff to her that I'm sure gets to her, but we're willing to have conversations about it and keep moving the conversation forward. We make an effort. My dad, on the other hand, has not tried to contact me since that divorce hearing. He's not tried to have any relationship with me whatsoever. And I got to the point where I realized trying to make this happen or trying to have a relationship with this person is only hurting me. It is something I've got to let go of. So that is a very long answer to your question about how I came out and that journey of how those relationships developed over the years.
No, but thank you. Thank you for being, completely open and honest about where that's at. And I think you've touched on some really important topics in there about, I feel sometimes what is holding some men back is that constant need to still be seen and loved and validated by the parents because they still pedestal them, even as bad as that relationship had been. And at some point, they still see them as the parents and needing to parent them to help them move forward. And for me, there's a point in time in men and women's lives, in both, but where we turn around and go, actually, I am now the adult. And I can now actually reparent my own hurt, wounded inner child that was never seen and was never loved. Like, I'm alive today and I can be safe today, whether, straight, gay, whatever you want to call, person of color, whatever else. I can make a decision today that that's in my past and I can now be the adult to me and my inner child. And I can go through this discomfort of rechilding and reparenting myself and take accountability and responsibility to move forward. And so so what you said, I think, is really super powerful because, I see, and you said it beautifully at the very start about there are things that happen in our past that actually keep us staying small, keep us being in the chameleon state and everything else, because it's a point in time where we don't flip into that, or people wait until their parents pass away.
Yep.
And then they go, I'm going to get on for life, but they're mid-50s, they're mid-60s, because they've held on to this thing. And so, for me, there's a point where we need to do that. And it sounds like, to a degree, you've sort of got to that point and you're saying, hey, no, this is now my life and I'm leading my life, particularly if I look at, writing the books and you're now offering service back. I see a combination of that's probably a healing journey for you as well. By giving to others, it's helping you go through a constant healing journey. I know that's what I do a lot of this work for because, for me, by me being a service and helping other men go through and deal with that, I have aha moments pop up. Like it's like a therapy session every time I'm dealing with other men. I'm like, oh, shit, that's something I haven't dealt with in my life.
Yep.
Great. I'm glad that got called out. So,
Yeah, the psychologists, the folks much smarter than me, call that the moment of differentiation. When you can turn around and see mom as a human being, when you see dad as a human being, not who they are in relation to you or what they were supposed to, could have, should have done for you, but who are they as their own separate human entity.
Mm.
And that's a very, very powerful moment in a person's life when you can recognize their humanity. And it was, at least it was for me, and realizing that you are the savior, but you've been looking for, right? Like
Yes, that's
you are, you are a man, and that's something else. This is a little bit of a tangent, but gay men in particular, we don't have a lot of ceremony, and especially before gay marriage became legal in the US. I think for straight men, I've been a little bit jealous all of my life because there is more ceremony and ritual to parts of life. So getting married, have kids, like there are these moments of becoming a quote unquote man that gay men often miss out on. And I think that there's a lot of work in my community to do to create our own rituals and ceremonies and declaring that. I had to admit that I was fine calling myself a guy, but to declare myself a man, I was well into late 30s before I made that declaration. And I loved what you said about the inner child. I've done exercises with my clients where I physically will put the present here and now self between dad and the inner child, letting yourself be that protector so that the inner child can be a child. I think, for me and a lot of the men that I work with, the inner child is exhausted. The inner child has been playing defense and playing the role of protector and standing up for you and being in the driver's seat of your life. Things are going off the rails in a lot of, it was in my life and a lot of the men that I work with, things were going off the rails because the person in the driver's seat was the inner child. And there's so much work to be done now to let the inner child actually be a child. Let the inner child experience joy and love and happiness and play. And I think there's so much work to be done with that. And the thing that you said about the books, yes, and I've alluded to that a little bit, at getting to write now and work with men and I just held a gay men's forum in San Francisco and working with men in a small group and helping them through their own journey. And like you, I don't come from it from the man at the, Moses on the mountaintop bringing the 10 Commandments down. I am a fellow traveler. I am on the journey with the people that I work with. It's just that I've had the luxury of spending a lot of time thinking about it and getting help and figuring some tactics and strategies and developing the skills to recognize my own bullshit and help myself move through it more efficiently and more quickly. And that's what I'm out there sharing now.
Yeah, beautiful. And I always see myself as I'm just at a different stage on the journey than the men I'm supporting. And so I've supported some men and they're going, I'd love to be able to do what you're doing. I said, yeah, well, in 4 years you can. Like, that's all I am.
Yep.
Like, I'm 4 or 5 years maybe ahead of where you are because, I chose to make a decision and I went deep and I did some workshops and I did with the breath work and I've done the trauma work and these sorts of things. So if you want to jump on this path, then do the work. Like, it's great you've done my program or this, but now that all I keep saying to guys who've gone through the programs that I work with him or the coaching is like, all we've done is started. Like,
Exactly.
Buckle up because the discomfort's still yet to come and you've got to work the way through. I just want to slide back into the ritual thing. In relation to, you're right, in relation to marriage and being able to have kids, there are certain rituals. I still see there's a lot of boys getting married and a lot of boys having kids. and
Absolutely. Yeah.
Right. Purely because there's a major ritual that all men have now missed. So if you look back and at the very start, I gave acknowledgement to Indigenous tribes. And if you look at every Indigenous tribe around the world, and even those that are still able to hold true to their culture, they all have a ritual of boy to man. It's a very, very defining process. There's these processes I know in the US with Lakota and those tribes where you'll go out and water fast for 4 days, like on your own in the middle of nowhere, and you'll wait for the great spirits to come and talk to you. Or there's physical activities that take place around, in African tribes where you'll get circumcised at the age of 14 and you cannot blink, you cannot whine, you cannot make a noise. If you do, you're not considered a man. If you don't, then that's when you become a man. So there's these really brutal and there's some other subtler ones. But in our Western society, we don't have that. Kindergarten, primary school for us, secondary school, go off to college, go and get your corporate job, or go down the trade path and do your apprenticeship, become a tradesperson, and then you put into what I feel is a very sometimes not quite mature environments. And so we predicate this boyhood, and then if I find a girl, I go and get married, but I'm still angry, I'm still abusive, I'm still on drugs, I'm still on alcohol, because I'm still escaping everything that took place because I never had that ritual. So I know there are elements of that in this thing, but I think there's a commonality that in our white Western society, and I'll say white Western society, even some now that are more integrated in that, we just don't have that ritual of boy to man. And it's not until we start this sort of work.
Yeah. And it's missing. It's missing. I'm not as studied as you are on the indigenous rituals, but I am definitely someone that feels the need for it. I have felt it in my own life and with the men that I've worked with. There does need to be a demarcation in our lives, a separation between the season of our lives when we are a boy and the season of our life to become a man. So yeah, I'm there with you on that.
So let's chat about where you're at now. So obviously you're doing the work, and as I said, I think when we spoke about earlier, you've actually got your Human Progress and Development Institute. Can we talk a bit about that and what that looks like for you and the work you're doing in that space?
Yeah, right now the work is the book, writing, coaching, speaking. So I'm doing a lot of work with like corporate ERG groups and speaking. These are employee resource groups. So corporations will have groups inside of their company where people that identify as LGBT plus can have a group that commiserates and works on issues or does volunteer work, or there are all sorts of ways that they gather together and do things around the initiatives that matter to that specific subgroup. And one of the things that they do is bring in guest speakers. And so I've been doing quite a bit of going in and being the guest speaker, giving them books. And then I do coaching, private coaching, and then I'm doing events. So hosting something called the Gay Men's Forum, where bringing together gay men who work on the things that we've been talking about here today. Next month, I'm hosting a thing called the Second Coming Out, which is apropos to what we were discussing earlier. There comes a time in our life when I've explained already how I saw the first coming out. I think there needs to be more of a declaration around the second coming out, that time in your life when you realize that your sexuality is just a small part of who you are and probably not the most interesting part of who you are. And who would you be and what life would you create if you weren't living into someone else's expectations, or you weren't living with the internalized homophobia or the fear or the shame around that? So what is this life that you would create? And I've coined that the second coming out, and that's a 3-day workshop that I'm holding. And the Institute is for folks that want to get certified in the methods that I'm doing. That's a certifying entity and sort of holding company for the different methods that I work on. I have 4 different coaching methods. One is the Break and Untangle. It's a performance coaching method. I have a leadership training that I do. We have accountability coaching and transformational coaching. And so those 4 stack up to create what I call the Institute for Human Progress and Development.
Awesome. I really love that. So the one thing that I ask all of my guests is, because you've been generous with your time this morning, is there something like a message that you would put out to men? And I'm happy to be focused on gay men, because that's predominantly your area of focus, about what they could do, or just something that you want to wrap up to say, hey, here's the key message that you've learned along the way that maybe you could put out there just as a final wrap up.
Sure. For me, every day when I wake up and my feet hit the floor, I understand that I have a decision to make about how I'm going to approach the day. I can either suffer from the way things were, or could have been, or should have been, or ought to be, or I can suffer toward creating the life that I want for myself, the people that I love, the causes that I care about. And that tiny little distinction, choosing to suffer toward rather than suffering from, isn't just going to make a better day, but in my experience, it's going to create a better life. And so anybody that's listening to this, I would encourage you to get up every day and make the decision to suffer toward creating that life that is possible and worthy of the inevitable struggle that comes with creating anything, and go out there and suffer toward.
Beautiful. I love that, Chad. That's a really nice way to wrap it up. Where can people find you? So if they're looking for you or they're interested in, say, maybe doing your coaching programs or these sorts of things, how can people find you?
The best way is on my website. Anybody that's listening can get a free copy of my book right there on the homepage of my website. Or you can find me on Facebook, Instagram, or LinkedIn.
No worries. And that's chadpeevy.com.
That's right.
Awesome.
Yep.
Chad, I've loved this conversation. Yeah, it's when we connect via a platform like Podmatch, there's, I don't know whether you host your own podcast as well, but there's all the whole, and there's been a conversation that takes place with some people. I go, no, I can see that you're not going to go, talk into your journey. But you're like, yeah, I'm happy to talk into this. And I just really want to thank you. I know it takes courage to be able to talk into past stories and share the vulnerability of what took place in your life. So thank you very much for that. It was an honor and a privilege to have had you on here and for you to have talked into that level. I can see, you're such a beautiful man. I know that the men that you're working with just have this great opportunity to have someone's lived experience. And I'm sure that if they're working with you, that they're just going to be able to grow and enhance and move forward. So, yeah, it's great to have, I'm glad we connected and great to have on board. So thank you very much.
Thank you for having me. And I know that putting together a podcast is a labor of love. And so thank you for doing what you're doing and sharing the microphone with me and allowing me to have a voice here on your platform. I sincerely appreciate that.
No worries. Thanks, man. I know it's evening over there for you. So thank you very much. I hope you're going to go and have a beautiful dinner. I think it's Friday night, so end of the week. So you're going to enjoy a beautiful dinner, and we'll definitely chat again soon. I look forward to staying in touch. Thanks, Chad.
Take care.
Bye. Hey all. So what a fantastic chat. I just loved how open and honest Chad was willing to be in relation to his journey and his story. And yeah, I can only, again, not being a straight guy, I can't say I know what it felt like because I'm not there, but I can only imagine in my heart how challenging that must be to live potentially a dual life your whole life, and having to be this chameleon. And as we spoke about in the podcast, how exhausting that must be. So for any men that's out there who, have had to go through this journey and just don't know where they're at, you can reach out to someone like Chad, you can reach out to someone like myself. We are here. We're non-judgmental. We're not going to say anything. It's just a journey you're on, and we're willing to be able to help you and support you moving forward. Or if things are getting really, really tough, there's definitely lifelines and other numbers that you can actually call to reach out. So let's make sure that you're getting the support you need. All right, so I'm going to wrap up. As you know, you can actually find me on Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn. Just search for Stephen Milverton and you will find me there. So that's a wrap for episode 69 of the Unearthed Man podcast. Send you much love and peace. Take care.